This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 461 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Betting on the NFL is great. Betting on the NFL with FanDuel Sportsbook, that's even better. Right now, FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to bet on the NFL season with reduced risk with their exclusive same-game parlay insurance. Simply place a 3-leg or more parlay on any NFL game to be eligible for the offer and follow along as the game unfolds. If you don't win your bet, FanDuel will refund your bet up to $25 in site credit. So what do you have to lose? Head to FanDuel Sportsbook and place your same-game parlay today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, Tennessee, and Iowa. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER in West Virginia. Visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. And in Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. All right, let's get to these questions. This first question says, how have your predictions and recommendations held up this year as opposed to typical non-insane pandemic maximum chaos seasons? Same percentage of hits? I honestly usually judge my recommendations and how I did in a particular year as an analyst by looking at how my teams did. The advice I give is the same advice that I use. And I'd say that I've had a pretty average year, maybe a slightly below average year. And I also don't know if the season itself, I don't know if it's been that different than most years. Like, yeah, it's been different, of course. There's a lot more news to follow. There aren't any fans. It's a very different season from that perspective. But as an analyst, it's not that different. So I don't think an analyst having a bad year should just blame the year 2020. Maybe we as analysts would have been able to be on some more breakout players if the preseason happened, but let's not pretend that we're like watching a different sport. But I had my typical hits and misses. Last year was probably better than this year because there were better hits, there were bigger hits. But I also had some bigger in-season misses last year. I think anyone listening to this right now who listened to the show throughout the year, they would probably say that I was fine this year, at least compared to other seasons. But there was nothing special. You know, it's funny. Sometimes my advice really helps someone and really hurts someone else. Like, for instance, I remember early on in this show, I was early as a 16th transaction in one of the 15 transaction shows. I was early on T. Higgins and Chase Claypool. I've had people thank me for being on T. Higgins and Claypool. But I have others who don't even remember that stuff. What they remember is me being low on Stephon Diggs entering the season. So this obviously depends on who's answering that question of, did you have a good year or not? I do think I was higher on players like James Robinson and Deontay Johnson this year. Those were good hits. But like I said, I wasn't very high on Stephon Diggs, and I also wasn't very high on Keenan Allen. Those were big misses. I will say, though, I think my general draft strategy this year, I think that was on point. I think draft strategy is a reason why my teams are doing fine. But I got a few questions like this one this week to talk about biggest hits and biggest misses. And just so you guys know, I do 2 podcasts in January every single year where I walk through this. I go through my biggest misses on one show, see what went wrong, and then I do the opposite on another show. It's a good way for me to hold myself accountable while also refining my process. This next question is from @NeverWideRight. When looking at projections to choose starters on Sunday, is it bad process to go through and look at things like wide receiver, cornerback matchups, game totals, game script, etc.? If I like the site, I'd assume they've done this already, so I feel like I might be double counting certain things. I can pretty much assure you that you wouldn't be double counting things, because a lot of what you're talking about can be subjective. Like, game totals themselves are not subjective, but the application of game totals, that is subjective. How heavily a projection system or a person weighs that stuff has some subjectivity. Not only that, but I would advise anyone who's looking at different sites for fantasy advice to not make assumptions. It's why it's always important to read what analysts are saying and why they like or don't like certain players. Don't just read a rankings list and say, I'm going with this. Look at the why. Understand the why. Now, I can tell you that NumberFire's projections, which are built by an algorithm and constantly monitored throughout the week, they're pretty strong as a baseline. But if you're looking strictly at a projection system, my guess is that they're not weighing something like cornerback matchups nearly as heavily as you might think. So if you want to manually adjust based on perceived cornerback matchup, feel free. But I should also add, It's very easy to overstate those matchups. I just don't know exactly how you're using projections and advice, so I can't tell you exactly what to change here. This next question says, can you trust Pittman rest of season with Hilton starting to show signs of life? So as I alluded to on the 15 Transaction Show this week, because of the Colts schedule, I think that you've got to hold on to both Michael Pittman and T.Y. Hilton. The main problem is that they're both still only reliable in deeper leagues or maybe as wide receiver threes. Like, don't let recency bias totally overshadow that T.Y. Hilton has sucked this year in fantasy football. His 31% target share last week was great, but he also had a 12% target share the week before that. The bottom line here is that the Colts spread things around, and it's very frustrating. So either guy can have a big week in a plus matchup. It's just not going to be super predictable. That's why technically you can't really trust either wide receiver. But I'd still hold on to them because things happen and players get hurt. And they wouldn't be terrible replacements given their schedule in weeks 14 and 15. This next question says, any defenses or players with exceptional week 15 matchups to pick up this week for teams with a first round bye? Yeah, so look, I've tried to bring this up on my shows over the last month or so to help you guys out here. But I'll lay it out again since I got this question a few times this week. Cleveland is one defense that may be out there still because they get Baltimore this week, but they get both New York teams in weeks 15 and 16. I know I sound like a broken record. I've brought this up on the show so many times, but they should be added. I'd also say that a lot of people want there to be like this really clear, clean answer here. This one singular plug and play defense. Doesn't always work like that. So let's go ahead and look at week 15 only real quick. And keep in mind, the percent rostered for defenses this time of year, it shoots up. So there aren't really low rostered defenses to choose from right now. So I'll be a little bit looser with my restrictions. But Minnesota gets Chicago. They're rostered in about half of Yahoo leagues. They work. You can go Buffalo against Denver in week 15 if they're available. Arizona gets Philadelphia. San Francisco gets Dallas. Any of those defenses work. But again, hopefully you were able to take advantage of the 15 transactions recommendations over the last few weeks, and you have a team like Cleveland or Seattle. In week 16, it's not as pretty. Philly gets Dallas. You could go there. The Chargers get Denver. That's a good play. And then Arizona gets San Francisco. That might work. But again, all of this is a big reason I was trying to plan ahead with defenses on the 15 transactions episode. Because the options based on percent roster numbers, they aren't that great in weeks 15 and 16. But those are some defenses that you can at least consider. This next question is from @Desperado28. You have been using adjusted fantasy points allowed frequently this year. Have you looked into rather this is predictive as opposed to descriptive? Isn't there a lot of sample size noise? I mean, look, there's a whole lot of sample size noise in everything that we do with football analysis. I can tell you that schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed is better than just regular fantasy points allowed though. But yeah, it's not the end all. You shouldn't be making decisions simply based off of adjusted points allowed or fantasy points allowed. It's why I always lead my non-quarterback analysis with volume. And it's why I reference team totals and pace and game environment and all of those factors that go into whether or not a player should be started. But I do think people should understand that most data in fantasy football isn't ultra predictive. Like the good predictive metrics in fantasy would not fly in other industries. But all of these pieces sort of come together like a puzzle. And they tell us whether or not we should start a player. Not one metric is going to tell us everything. This next question is from @PardonMyFrench. On a week-to-week basis, how do you determine which quarterback to start? It's easy when you have just an obvious player, but in one of my single quarterback dynasty leagues, I have Lamar, Kyler, and Justin Herbert. That's a good problem to have. I often find myself picking the wrong quarterback when I look at matchups. So I don't really know how to answer the how do you determine which quarterback to start question because there are so many factors each week. But that's what the matchup show is for. I talk through the process and the things that I look at when making a decision at each position. So for quarterbacks, I'm looking at game totals and game environment stuff to go along with the individual matchups that quarterbacks might be able to exploit. Things like pressure rate and so on. Sometimes those decisions are a 50-50 coin flip. And sometimes it bites you in the you-know-what when it doesn't go your way. That happens in fantasy football. You guys have to accept this. You're going to make bad start-sit decisions sometimes. I do it. I made one that knocked me out of the playoffs. I have the third most points in the league, and because of this really bad start-sit decision that I made the other week, I'm now out of the playoffs. But I look back and I ask myself, was this logical? And if it was logical, I try not to be that upset over it. Because this is a process over results game. If you have a sound process, if you're making the right decisions when those decisions have to be made, then you're doing it right. The result will not always favor you. There's only one league champion at the end of the year. Of course you want it to be you. And of course it doesn't always go your way. But if you're smart with it and you're logical, then you're going to win out in the long run. But on top of this, what I also think happens is that we fall victim to negativity bias. You may have not done well in choosing your quarterbacks this year. That's going to happen in a small sample. But negativity bias also can creep in. Negativity bias is when things more negative in nature have a greater effect on someone's psychological state and process. You remember those negative experiences and you adjust your process more based on those negative experiences. So for instance, I remember this start-sit choice from 2 weeks ago. And it eats at me because I would have made the playoffs and I probably had a shot at the title because my roster is really good. But what I don't think about are the good decisions that I made. The good decisions that got me wins. Because those are almost assumed. It's assumed that you make good decisions. That your process led to a good result. And then we just remember the ones where our good process led to a bad result. That's negativity bias. So I would say that before any of us get upset about always making the wrong start-sit decisions, make sure that number one, you're recognizing the small sample sizes that we work within, and that number two, you're not only remembering the negative side of things, because that can overshadow what could otherwise be a totally normal and fine process. This next question is from @Bodentown. In this week's 15 transactions, you alluded to Atlanta's defense being a good matchup for the Chargers, but hasn't the Atlanta defense performed much better in recent weeks? The Falcons defense has been better in general since Raheem Morris took over. And I think regression was going to naturally hit that defense a little bit too. Defenses that perform poorly generally get a little bit better as the season goes on. And then the opposite is true too. It's just how small samples work. But even still, Taysom Hill last week threw for over 230 yards in a pair of scores. That was a nice uptick over what he did the last time that he faced Atlanta in his first career start. Drew Lock in week 9 came through, even though some of that was in garbage time. Kirk Cousins in week 6 was a top 10 quarterback. Atlanta's not as good of a matchup as they were maybe in like week 3, but they're still a good matchup. They're still good enough. I do have some concerns this week because the line isn't as high as I might have expected. And look, there's always the chance that Herbert tanks again. I'm not calling him a lock, but I would definitely still call Atlanta a good matchup versus a bad one. This next question is from @RKilmer23. Does your start-sit process change in the playoffs when you are the perceived underdog? No, it doesn't change because it's the same game. Nothing changes in fantasy football from the regular season to the playoffs. You're still playing the exact same game that you were playing before. If you're a perceived underdog in the regular season and you need some upside, you might roll the dice on more ambiguity. That's no different in the playoffs. If you need upside, you might go for a player like Jalen Hurts over a lower ceiling quarterback because we don't know exactly what Hurts is bringing to the table. But we do know that there's rushing upside potential. So for instance, and I'm recording this before the Thursday night game, so I could sound like an idiot, but I'm putting myself out there. I don't care. I'm starting Jalen Hurts over Jared Goff this week. I don't like Jared Goff's matchup at all, and I do need a little bit of upside in this particular matchup. And I see Goff as having a pretty low ceiling in this matchup. Again, you're going to be listening to this on Friday, maybe Saturday, and I might sound like an absolute moron because Jared Goff might have gone off on Thursday night. But I think process-wise, it makes sense for my team in that moment to choose Jalen Hurts. Now, I don't think Hurts is this like great play this week. But overall, you shouldn't approach the playoffs really all that differently than the regular season in any normal format. Do what got you there. This next question is from @dip_sand. In the playoffs, would you rather play it safe and start your studs against tougher matchups, such as Diggs versus Pittsburgh, or roll the dice and start guys with more favorable matchups that aren't considered studs at the moment, such as Tyler Boyd versus Dallas? Okay, so just to reiterate, your process really shouldn't change because it's the playoffs. Get that idea out of your head. The goal is the exact same. You're trying to score the most fantasy points. And I think this start your stud idea is mostly dumb because it's subjective. It's not like we have this list of players who are studs and a list of players who aren't. Now, with that being said, if you're talking about Stephon Diggs, he should be started. It's not like the Steelers secondary is this shutdown unit. And if you're looking at someone like Boyd, who sure, he has a good matchup, but he's in a way less desirable situation. And I'm going to always, in that case, lean towards the player in a better offense who should see more volume and is honestly in a game that has a higher scoring ceiling. I know I don't answer start-sit questions on here, but I think this was more of a process question. Always lean volume first and only really care that much about matchups at the extremes. This last question is from @Zachary_MJ. Hey JJ, who are some streaming quarterbacks that you see could lead to fantasy championships? I've been riding with Taysom Hill for a few weeks now, but with Breeze looming, Hill will no longer be an option for me. So yeah, we'll see what happens with Drew Brees, but I'll do what I did with the defenses earlier on the show and just shout out some lower roster quarterbacks with good matchups in weeks 15 and 16. In week 15, you might be able to play Jalen Hurts depending on how he does against New Orleans. And that's why he was a transaction earlier this week. Phillip Rivers gets Houston, which I mentioned earlier this week. If Matthew Stafford is out there, which he is in 40% of Yahoo leagues, he gets Tennessee. Maybe Teddy against the Packers. Those are really the only guys I have decent confidence in who might be on your waiver wire. Drew Lock faces Buffalo, but I wouldn't want to trust Drew Lock or even Alex Smith against Seattle. I wouldn't really want to trust them with so much on the line. In week 16, Hurts gets Dallas, Baker Mayfield gets the Jets, Tua gets the Raiders, and Mitch Trubisky gets the Jags. I will say, I'm not meaning to call anyone out here specifically, but I do think these types of questions, they showcase the need to plan ahead. It's hard to give specific advice for your league because I don't know who's available. But it's important to have a strong plan at quarterback and defense as we enter the playoffs because fantasy managers start to hoard those positions as we move closer to the end of the season because they don't need running back and wide receiver depth as much. So that's something to keep in mind for next season. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks everyone. Good luck in the playoffs this weekend. I will talk to you next week.